Good afternoon. I would like to acknowledge that we are on Treaty 6 territory today, the traditional home to the Alexander First Nation, Alexis Nakota Sioux Nation, Enoch Cree Nation, Whitefish Lake First Nation, and Paul First Nation. And this land also has a very deep importance to the Métis people of Alberta Region 4. I'm so proud to stand here in front of you with all Albertans. I know that we're exhausted from COVID, but it is so wonderful to be able to see a light at the end of this tunnel. And I'm very excited to be able to announce Bill 58, the Freedom to Care Act, which will be tabled in the legislature later today. This past year has been exceptional, to say the least, and one for everybody, but we've also seen the incredible power of nonprofit organizations that have risen to the challenge over and over again to serve Albertans. And they're at their best when they are agile and they can rely on their community relationships. And this is especially true in emergencies and community crises. However, we've also seen situations where there are some of our nonprofits that were not able to help in the time of need because of government regulations. For example, a local Hutterite colony tried to deliver hundreds of sandwiches to a temporary shelter, and that was actually during the floods in 2013. And this generous donation had to be turned away because the shelter did not know or was not sure if it complied with the provincial regulations. In this case, there actually were exemptions to the regulations that could have been applied if the shelter had known about them. And government regulations are generally intended for businesses and are not always best suited to regulate nonprofit organizations. Many regulations intended for commercial purposes often have exemptions for nonprofits and charitable groups, obviously because of the really unique nature of their work. So there's not an easy pathway for nonprofits to find access to these exemptions. So if it's passed, the Freedom to Care Act would let nonprofits focus on their work instead of having to navigate existing exemptions to the regulations. Si elle est adoptée, la loi sur la liberté d'agir permettra aux organismes sans but lucratifs de se concentrer sur leur travail plutôt que de naviguer les nombreuses exceptions existantes aux réglementations. It would give Cabinet the power to grant one-time short-term exemptions to the regulations for nonprofits performing a social good when an exemption doesn't already exist. In support of this legislation, there's going to be a website that is created to help the nonprofits to identify and access existing exemptions to regulations. And the website will also include the contact forms that support nonprofits with accessing these exemptions, or if they're requesting a new one. Another important way this legislation would support nonprofits in their work is by introducing a new volunteer liability protection. This legislation would ensure that an individual volunteer who performs a service for a nonprofit organization or the Crown cannot be held personally responsible or personally liable for damages or harm. Cette législation garantirait qu'un individu qui se porte bénévole et rend des services à un organisme sans but lucratif ou à la quelqu'un ne peut être tenu personnellement responsable de dommages ou de préjudice. This would apply as long as harm was not caused or criminal willful misconduct, or when the volunteer was operating a motor vehicle. The volunteer also must be acting within the scope of his or her responsibilities and must properly be licensed, certified, or authorized. These new liability protections for volunteers are to encourage and to help more volunteers and more Albertans to help their neighbors and to continue serving their communities. Through the past year, we have seen nonprofits go above and beyond in their communities. It's been inspiring, to tell the truth. And the Freedom to Care Act would make it so much easier for civil society organizations to access and request exemptions to regulations. La loi sur la liberté d'agir permettrait aux organismes de société civile d'accéder plus facilement aux exceptions des réglementations et aussi d'en demander plus facilement. Letting them do what they do best, helping Albertans. Thank you. I would like to invite Nina Saini with Punjabi Community Health Services in Calgary to speak about the importance of this proposed legislation.
Hi, thank you, Minister here. So the Freedom of Care Act, for an organization like PCHS, we provide the South Asian community with counseling supports that are culturally aware and in first language. And we're very niche and have an expertise. And an act like this would allow us to respond quickly to kind of minimize the collateral damage in a vulnerable situation for already pre-existing vulnerable populations like our own. It would help us be well equipped to be able to support in a moment of crisis, understanding that things like language and communication barriers exist. Multi-generational households might need support all at once, and even just being able to provide that cultural and community connection in a crisis situation. We'd be able to mobilize resources, services, volunteers through our own South Asian community connections. And the response would be targeted, impactful, and effective. And this is particularly important for racialized and marginalized communities in order to give an equitable response and resources in a time of crisis. So we'd essentially be a part of a solution when we need it the most and when it matters the most.
Thank you so much for all that you do and for your amazing contributions to community.
Okay, we'll be now taking questions. There will be one question and one follow-up. And operator, you can put through the first caller, please. Oh, and just a reminder, this press conference is embargoed, so please do not share any of the information before the bill has been tabled.
First question is Audrey Nippo with Radio Canada. Go ahead, Audrey.
Hi, thank you, Minister, for your remarks, and especially in French. I really appreciate it. I would have a question for you and also for Nina. Could you both give us examples, concrete examples, of how these exemptions and exclusion of liability would apply to organizations, and for Nina, especially in yours in particular?
Nina, do you want to go first and then I'll follow up?
Sure. So an organization like ours, we partner and collaborate with a lot of other South Asian serving agencies. So if there was a crisis moment, that's kind of out of our counseling realm, but we would be able to mobilize those services through volunteers and be a part of the response. It would allow us to do that and not be at the mercy of a mandate, essentially, or worried about the liability.
Yeah, and so to follow up with that, government has actually created barriers for these organizations. I'll give you an example actually in my own riding. Pastor Karp, who has the Harvest Healing Center in Strathmore, and she's just an amazing advocate in the community for supports for everything. They have a kitchen and everything. So when they were opening their space, which was supported by the community, they were held up because of an issue with HVAC. And had they been able to go to the municipal leaders, and had the municipal leaders known that they could have gone to the municipal portfolio at the government level, they would have been able to get that exemption. So some of this is about shining light on organizations that already have exemptions, but there's also organizations that have not been able to receive exemptions. So this will give them a central place to be able to go and truly be able to give our nonprofit organizations everything they need to be able to do social good in their communities, which is what they do best.
And I understand that there are some examples that do not relate to money, but some do. So why not just provide these organizations with the money that they would need to comply with the regulations in place? I mean, they're there for a reason.
It's not about particular regulations that are money-oriented. It's about an organization already having the capacity to do that and then being able to get permission to actually do that. Like I said, the Hutterites are another good example. They brought all of these sandwiches, were wanting to help out, but the shelter that was there didn't believe that there was an exemption that they could actually help out these people that were on the front lines of helping. So it's actually about it's an enabling piece of legislation that is to the broader scope. If you remember, we had the Alberta Care Connector when the COVID crisis first hit, in order to broaden the aspect of being able to get volunteers connected with the people that they could help out with, because a large part of our volunteers very quickly became a vulnerable population because they're in seniors. So it's a broader perspective of being able to really create legislation to help volunteers do what they do best, but also make sure that organizations have the ability to find out if they can get an exemption, especially in the middle of a crisis. Because, as you know, sometimes you can put things through, it might take 6 to 8 weeks to get an answer. We want to make sure that we have as much ability to respond as quickly as possible, and especially given the last year, it's never been more important.
Thank you. And operator, you can put through the next caller, please.
Next is Janet French with CBC. Go ahead, Janet.
Hi there. Thanks for taking my question. I'm trying to understand this individual liability issue. How does that work now? I mean, I feel like nonprofits must have some kind of insurance to protect themselves from lawsuits or legal action. So why is that current status quo inadequate, and how would this individual volunteer liability assist?
That's a great question, actually. So not every volunteer is under a particular organization, and the volunteer liability that falls under the organization is actually for the organization. But if you have a situation, for example, we were asking this question ourselves too as we were going through this process, but for example, if somebody was stacking boxes at a particular location and the boxes fell and somebody got hurt, that volunteer then could be liable under the present, the way that the things work right now, could actually be held liable even though it's within the scope of their duty and it was just an accident. So it's about adding protections for that volunteer so that within the scope of their work, if something happens by accident, that the organization can't just go after that volunteer who's there in good conscience and is doing things for all the right reasons. But as we know, people are human beings and things happen. So we just want to make sure that those volunteers have that protection. And you're correct. Under certain organizations, there's already liability protection, but there is a gap, and so that's the gap that we're trying to fill.
All right, just to speak on that, is that okay?
Mm-hmm.
The gap also is that very specific organizations, for instance, like us, we're a counseling agency. So our insurance is within that scope. If there was a crisis situation and we felt like we could bring our South Asian community together and provide support outside of the realm of counseling or being in an office, that would put our volunteers in a vulnerable situation where they would be liable. And so this would allow us to mobilize a response that's kind of outside of our scope, that we're still able to coordinate within our ability and not have any of our volunteers at risk.
And that's right, Nana. And the legislation we're bringing in also does not change their organizational liability. So it's just an added piece to make sure that these volunteers have the ability to go out and do the excellent work that they do for social good.
And did you have a follow-up question, Janet?
I do. I was curious to the minister, some of these nonprofit umbrella organizations say, really, the survey that you did shows that it's not red tape and bureaucracy that's getting in the way of them doing good work. It's just general ability to get grant funding and government funding. So I suppose what do you have to say to that? Are there any plans at all within your difficult financial situation to increase the amount of funding available to organizations to do this kind of charitable work?
Thanks, Janet. Well, one of the things we did, we've had to be creative, and one of the things we did right at the beginning of the COVID crisis is that we leveraged $2 million of hard-earned taxpayer dollars here at the government and worked with United Way and other organizations to leverage those dollars to help out with community good. And it was a really marvelous way to see how we could work together. We're going to leverage these dollars to the best of our ability to help out as many community organizations as we can. And I have to say that my experience working with the organizations across the board, everybody has suffered over this last year. It's been it's been unbelievable how difficult it's been, and yet, the organizations keep coming back to us with ideas and ways to be able to collaborate together, and it's been really inspiring. So we're just going to continue to work, and it may take some time to assess and see if there are gaps in those situations. I'm sure that there probably are, but we're looking forward to continuing on those consultations and working alongside with them. So.
Thank you. And operator, can you put through the next caller, please?
Next is Ashley Joanna with Post Media Edmonton. Go ahead, Ashley.
Hi, good afternoon. I just wanted to follow up on what Audrey asked. Both of the exemption examples you mentioned when answering her question are things that already exist. I understand wanting to make groups aware of what already exists, but I'm trying to get a better sense of what specifically this bill does that isn't already in place. So what type of exemptions does this legislation allow that doesn't already exist?
Sure, and you're right. There are several pieces of legislation that already contain the exemption specific. So you're talking, I think, about charitable and nonprofit groups. But the one-time exemptions through cabinet, especially under crisis, is what's really rare here, and that's what we're illuminating at this particular time. So there's no mechanism to grant a one-time reasonable common sense exemption to nonprofits if they're needed to support them in providing programs and services that benefit the community. So the one-time grant exemptions is probably the newest piece of this, but what the legislation actually does is brings to light a lot of exemptions. You're correct, they do exist, but so many people don't know that they exist. So the red tape isn't so much part of it is government, because we're the awareness from the organization to government to ask for that exemption is not always there. But we're also not, we're wanting to make sure that they have even less red tape, especially in a crisis situation where you don't always have the luxury of time to organize and to get yourselves put together in order to be able to help out. So we're wanting to make sure that that we can respond to an immediate community need.
But can you provide me with some specific examples of the type of exemptions that this legislation would allow that are not currently allowed through other programs?
So, for example, if an organization, and I was going to say, like the Hutterite organizations and other organizations that come, there are specific things, like the exemption exists, but it does not exist immediately. So the changes to the legislation helps with speed as much as helping to make sure that, and a lot of the exemptions exist under particular ministries. So a lot of the changes is actually happening at our level to make sure that the cabinet ministers and everybody who run their ministries that have exemptions are understanding those exemptions, putting a central place together so that an organization, and that's probably the most fulsome piece of it. An exact example that I can give you at this point in time will come as we start collecting data on how these exemptions work, because some exemptions do exist, but we're putting together a central website so that we can collect all of that data and then fly things up the flagpole as quickly as possible, especially in a crisis. So for example, during the crisis, we had a lot of organizations coming to the plate that wanted to help out with food security, for example. And if you look at community and social services, they were able to do an exemption for food security, but it still has to go through an entire process. So we want to try and loosen that up a little bit in the time of crisis so that we can get aid to people as quickly as possible.
Thank you so much. And operator, can you put through the next caller, please?
Final question on the line is Catherine Kurkowski with Alberta Today. Go ahead, Catherine.
Thanks for taking my question, Minister. So when you say a short-term exemption, is there anything in the legislation prescribing how short or how long these exemptions can be granted for?
Well, it would be nice, wouldn't it, to be able to put the grant, to put that exemption timing on there. But as we've learned with COVID, we just don't know how long things are going to last and what the need is going to be. So the common sense piece about it is to try and get it done and leverage that as quickly as possible. Timing, I suppose, would depend on need and the area. I mean, these are all very unique organizations that will have unique and very different spaces that they need to work in. Nana, I don't know if you want to comment on that because you're directly on the ground.
I think I'll reiterate what you say. Like, we just really don't know when a crisis situation happens and how bad it might be. So I don't know if you guys remember last summer, there was hailstorms in the northeast of Calgary, and that's a high population of South Asians that live there. And, had it been even, 20% more severe, the situations of people's housing and them being able to maybe even live in their homes, depending on like how aggravated the hailstorm could have been, made us sit back and realize going, hey, this is a bad situation, but it could have been much, much worse, and we would have needed to do more immediate response to make sure that we could figure out some sort of housing situation, communicate it to our community, and immobilize something like that. So I guess that's kind of a part of the beauty of this Freedom of Care Act for us, is knowing that if it is that high level crisis, we would expect that the responsiveness and the exemption would be given fairly quickly, and that, until those services are supporting the community, they would continue.
Yeah. So where we're really trying to help out is in response time and providing these one-time really common sense exemptions that may not exist. And like I said, there's a lot of folks that don't even know that exemptions do exist, let alone if there's a crisis situation, we got to think on our feet. And this legislation just gives us the ability to do that.
And was there a follow-up question?
Yes, please. So are there any guidelines around what type of exemptions are allowed? Because I'm thinking back to 2012 when there was an MLA who suggested giving meat tainted with E. coli to homeless people, which seems like a very bad idea for safety. So what rules are there going to be for guidelines around what can be exempt?
Yeah, I don't know about that exemption. I'm sorry, I can't speak to that. That's a really good example, though. So it's not just going to it has to come to cabinet, and then we'll do a review. But what changes with this is that normally that review could take anywhere from 6 to 8 weeks. Right? There's an entire process that has to go through, and there's a good reason for those processes. Please let me be clear that it's not about encroaching upon processes that are important. But what it does is that, we can have careful consideration. A lot of these will be coming from the MLA. So if there's something like that, I'm quite sure that AHS would be involved in requiring whether or not an exemption would happen with something as very different as that particular exemption that was asked for. But the most important piece is that if we can run them up the flagpole a little bit quicker in the time of crisis, we get to help organizations do what they want to do, which is to help people out on the ground. So I'm really excited to see how this happens. I mean, to tell you the truth, let's all hope that there's no more crisis and that this becomes a really great website where we're able to collect data. Because I think one of the wonderful things that will come out of this is that we'll have a lot of information about what exemptions do exist. Thereby, the empowering part of the legislation, which is to move quicker, will actually help organizations to understand what they have access to as far as exemptions. And you're asking a lot of questions about exemptions, which are really good because a lot of people don't know about them. So even highlighting that and bringing a discussion to this is so important. I mean, we have 26,400 nonprofits and 1.6 million volunteers. And these are, people who they do this just for the betterment of their communities. So if we can help them in a time of crisis to do their social good, that's what we'd like to do. And, if anything interesting comes up in a time of crisis, it'll go through cabinet. There'll be advisement from the ministries that are directly involved with any particular piece of or any particular issue that comes. And we'll take a look at that and then hopefully help these organizations get up and running as quick as possible. But that's a great question. I'm going to have to look into that.
All right, that's all for today. Thank you so much, everyone.